Hi, my name is Miriam Moore. I am Assistant Professor of English at the University of North Georgia in Gainesville, Georgia. My presentation today is titled, "'Cause Now I Want to Know, Stance Strategies and Knowledge Construction in Undergraduate Asynchronous Discussions." How do asynchronous online discussions, or AODs, support learning in virtual spaces? And what does a successful online forum look like? The pandemic has raised these questions to the fore over the past several months. A cursory review of published research suggests that both the implementation and assessment of AODs vary widely. Staging an AOD for collaborative learning is complicated by a number of factors, including the format of the prompt, participation requirements, grading criteria, linguistic expectations, time constraints, as well as moderator effectiveness. Research based in constructivist learning theory and systemic functional linguistics has framed AODs as hybrid genres, which feature both classroom initiate, respond, evaluate, or IRE sequences, as well as features of conversation. Within the genre, according to Lander 2014, logogenesis is not linear, but develops instead along an orbital curriculum macrogenre. Moreover, skilled discussion and moderators can use scaffolding structures to direct students towards new understanding, as Delahunty and her research team pointed out in 2014. In AODs, students navigate both content and relationship with their peers and their instructors. As they do so, what stances do they take? And what linguistic resources do they deploy to manage those stances throughout the discussion? Do those stances expand space for dialogue and construction of new understandings? This study addresses these questions and offers some very preliminary answers. For this study, contributions to 8 AODs were collected from a spring 2020 sociolinguistics course open to advanced undergraduates at a regional state university in the southeastern U.S. For each discussion, students posted at least 3 times prior to a Monday evening deadline. AOD formats alternated weekly. 4 discussions followed a traditional prompt, post reply, or PPR format, in which all students replied initially to the instructor's prompt. The other 4 discussions were chained, following Ropenack 2019. The instructor posted 2 or more initial threads, and after the first response to each thread, students replied only to the previous student post, not to the instructor. To foster exploration, instructor questions for both types of discussions were open-ended. The sample size for this study was quite small. Only 7 students agreed to participate in the IRB-approved study, and 4 of these also completed a short survey. When the class ended, posts of all consenting students were collected and de-identified. Direct responses to prompts in both the PPR discussions as well as direct replies to the instructor threads in chain discussions were tagged as initial posts, or IPs. The remainder were labeled response posts, or RPs. A word and clause count was calculated for each post. Then coding occurred iteratively, beginning with Highland's 2005 framework of stance and engagement strategies. Categories were expanded and refined through additional rounds of coding, as I will illustrate below. Following coding, raw counts were converted to a per 1,000 clause ratio for the purposes of analysis. The first set of codes indicates student use of framing language to introduce propositional content. Personal framing, such as I think, involves authorial self-mentions, following Highland 2005. Expert framing, or evidentials, required source attribution, as in sample number 1, while collective framing attributed assertions to the inclusive we, as in sample number 2. These framing strategies foreground the writer's relationship to propositional content. Emphasis has been added through italics in all sample excerpts. Next, epistemic stance markers were coded, which alert readers to the writer's confidence in their assertions, again following Highland and Jang 2016. According to Highland 2005, Hedges, for example, indicate the writer's decision to withhold complete commitment to a proposition. Hedges include a subset of personal frames, such as I guess, illustrated in example number 3, along with words such as possibly, maybe, and perhaps, as well as some modal verbs, might or could. Structures suggesting confidence in propositions were coded as boosters, again following Hyland's language from 2005, including certain personal or collective frames such as I or we know, expressions like certainly, absolutely, and no doubt, as in sample number 4, and some instances of modal verbs such as must. Occurrences of do in affirmative contexts, particularly when students made concessions and followed with responses, were also annotated as boosters, as in sample number 5. Metacognitive assertions were grouped with epistemic stance markers in terms of coding. In metacognitive assertions, participants explicitly addressed confusion, as in number 6, desired knowledge, realizations, or new learning. Codes denoting responses to other posts were adapted and simplified from both the attitude and engagement subsystems of appraisal, following Martin and White 2005. Codes included disagreement, as in example 7, agreement, as in sample 8, as well as affirmation and exclamation, as in sample 9. Hyland's 2005 classification system for engagement strategies anchored the final code groups. These included questions, which were coded according to the stated addressee, you-directed, as in sample 10, self-directed, as in 11, or we-directed, or third person, as in sample 12. They were also coded according to purpose, information-seeking, as in sample 10, exploratory, as in sample 11, clarifying, as in sample 12, along with other or rhetorical questions. Other engagement strategies that were coded include personal asides, directives, and reader mentions. According to Hyland 2005, personal asides allow writers to address readers directly and are often marked by dashes or parentheses, as in 13. Directives are imperatives moving readers towards action, as in sample 14 with the verb consider. Reader mentions were coded as follows: as direct address with you, as in 15, direct address by name, or inclusive we, as in 16. In terms of results, Table 1 illustrates the total number of each type of post and the average numbers of words and clauses in each. Initial posts were fewer in number than RPs, but longer in both average word count at 451.05 words per post and clause count at 64 clauses per post. Tables on this slide show the occurrence of framing and epistemic stance strategies in both initial posts and response posts. A comparison of the rates of occurrence per 1,000 clauses suggests some differences between the two. First, IPs exhibited a lower rate of personal framing at 73.6 occurrences per 1,000, but a higher rate of expert framing at 32.07 occurrences per 1,000 than response posts, which had rates of 120.16 and 9.11 per 1,000, respectively. In terms of epistemic stance, IPs contained fewer non-modal hedges, fewer boosters, and fewer metacognitive assertions per 1,000 clauses than did RPs. Modal verbs appeared as the dominant hedging strategy in the initial posts. In terms of responses to others, as might be expected, there were few instances of agreement or disagreement in initial posts compared to response posts. In addition, exclamations and affirmations rarely appeared in initial posts, whereas they were more common in response posts. Moreover, response posts included more questions overall than initial posts, 29.73 compared to 9.45 per 1,000 clauses. Initial post questions were most often rhetorical and third person, whereas information seeking and exploratory questions predominated in response posts, where you-directed and self-directed questions occurred at a similar rate to third-person questions. Finally, In terms of other engagement strategies, personal asides and directives appeared at similar rates in both IPs and RPs. However, as one might expect, direct address of both types, using you and by name, occurred more often in response posts, at 208 or 84.72 per 1,000 clauses in response posts, compared to only 1.23 per 1,000 clauses in initial posts. Inclusive we occurred in both types, but at a higher rate in the response posts. Data for this study came from different AOD structures, both traditional prompt post reply and chained. While in the traditional PPR format, all students posted initial responses to the instructor. In the latter, only 1 or 2 students per topic did so. These results suggest that regardless of the AOD structure, students use stance strategies differently when responding to instructor prompts than when replying to their peers. Initial posts resemble formal essays. In these posts, students use stance strategies to position themselves as academic writers who understand course concepts. Like formal essays, initial posts establish context within themselves. Readers may follow these easily without reference to the initial prompt. As knowers in these posts, students foreground their objectivity and offer expert support for propositions. Consider this excerpt, number 17, which comes from discussion 7. In this excerpt, the student establishes the topic with a general assertion and also provides expert framing through a reference to the textbook, which was by Kulmas. Reader-writer solidarity is indicated via inclusive we, which according to Highland is the most frequent engagement device used in academic writing. Modal hedges in the post, including can and may, do signal speculation and openness to other possibilities, although these possibilities are not pursued, nor are peers addressed directly. I have not posted the full post at this point, it was too long, but I would point out that personal framing occurred only once, later in the post, through a self-directed question. The student asked later, "It makes me wonder how our language choice shapes the way we think." But rather than opening exploration of that issue, the writer instead concluded the post with a quoted assertion as seen here, thereby contracting the dialogic space. Student survey comments concerning the traditional prompt post reply discussions further illuminate their perceptions of initial posts. One student said, as in excerpt 18, "This format was helpful because it allowed me to gather my thoughts and present them, knowing that not all of my classmates would read and comment on what I had to say." And in excerpt 19, "This format allowed me to engage my understanding on my own, which allowed me to work through my understanding of the topic in depth." Thus, in initial post, student stance strategies demonstrate that they have worked through topics in depth. The initial post becomes a platform for their individual presentation of thinking and learning, not collaborative thinking. Response posts, in contrast, are highly contextualized and conversational. Stance strategies here position students as supportive peers. Consider the following excerpts also from discussion 7, a PPR discussion. These responses illustrate stance strategies common to response posts: direct address by name or pronoun, and in this case, the abbreviation PNAME stands for a direct address by name. So there are direct address by name, affirmations such as "I like," metacognitive statements, "I've never really thought about that," personal framing, "I think," exclamations and emotions such as "yes" and "ha ha," boosters like "definitely," and exploratory questions, "I wonder if it's possible." Note, however, that these conversational stance strategies do not necessarily foster collaborative learning. The response in sample 20, for example, suggests a possible avenue to apply concepts in a new way, but the post turns to affirmation and does not expand that conversation further. And in fact, there were no additional replies to that particular response. In contrast, sample 21 ends with an exploratory question, which prompted sample 22 in response. But unfortunately, both samples 21 and 22 were posted just before the deadline at midnight for closing a discussion, and at that point, avenues for expanded online dialogue ended. Now, consider this excerpt, the fourth response in a thread from discussion 8, which was chained. This student asks 2 clarifying questions regarding the previous post in the chain. He asks, would establishing discourse switching as its own unique concept potentially make it a subcategory of code switching? Or would it be its own field of study independent from the concept tropes of code switching? Note that discourse switching had been coined by the students just earlier in this chain. This discussion contained just 2 initial posts, which left more room for discussion through response posts. The third post in the chain triggered 5 responses, one of which is excerpt 23, and excerpt 23 in turn prompted 5 additional replies. In this case, questions and RPs functioned as instructor scaffolding does, encouraging expanded dialogue, a finding echoed in student comments about chained discussions. As one student said, this format mimicked a dialogue instead of a write-up, allowing for a dynamic processes of learning. And that is exactly the way the student wrote this. Thus, chains of response posts are perceived as dialogue, in contrast to initial posts, which are seen as write-ups when they are required of all students in the traditional PPR format. Stance strategies evident in these posts suggest that undergraduates perceive the purposes and expectations for discussion posts differently, depending on the position of the post in the forum. When addressing the instructor through initial posts and responses to prompts, students position themselves as knowers through formal academic arguments. However, when replying to other students in response posts, they become supportive peers who may also, but not always, engage in collaborative knowledge construction. These conclusions, of course, are only preliminary, given the sample size and other factors that could be considered here, including the nature of prompts and instructor involvement. Nonetheless, this study raises important questions for additional research. If, as Martin has suggested, a genre is a staged, goal-oriented social process, what is the goal of an AOD? What affordances do traditional prompt post-reply and chained formats offer to support that goal? If the aim is collaborative construction of knowledge through text-based interaction, as Lander has suggested, does the individual knower stance evidenced in initial posts expand or contract space for such collaboration? Similarly, how does positioning as supportive peers with personal framing, affirmation, and exclamation affect dialogic space? How might extended time, adjusted assessment parameters, instructor modeling, or other adjustments to the format of a forum enhance knowledge construction in AODs? Would requiring a post-discussion summary change stance dynamics or the AOD outcomes? While the initial posts and response posts reviewed in this study cannot fully answer all of these questions, they remind us of the potential of AODs to pique students' intellectual curiosity. As one response post in my study suggested, those are really good questions, and I don't have answers to them, so I'm hoping someone else does, because now I want to know. Thank you very much.